Hey guys, tonight we're stepping inside the most glamorous, foul-smelling, rat-infested places of medieval Europe. Castles, but not the fairy tale kind. We're talking royal gout, chambers reeking of fermented urine, and kings so constipated they had entire priesthoods praying for their bowels to loosen. And if you think ruling a kingdom meant living like a king, just wait until you hear what they used for toilet paper. Spoiler, it had legs. If you're enjoying these weird, sleepy dives into history, I'd appreciate a quick like or even a subscribe. It helps way more than you know. And hey, I'm always curious where you're tuning in from. Drop a comment with your city and what time it is for you. Now lay back, close your eyes and try not to gag. Because tonight you're not just sleeping in a medieval castle, you're ruling it. You smell it before you see it. The warm, damp stench of wool, damp stone and flesh pressed into too many layers of clothing for far too long. The throne room is cavernous, echoing with footsteps and farts. You sit on your gilded chair like a statue in a cathedral of sweat. You are the king, and you stink. To be a medieval king was to be surrounded by ceremony and filth. Every inch of your castle is symbolic. Every step of your mourning is choreographed. But beneath the layers of symbolism is the crushing, constant truth. You're rotting from the inside out. Bathing is a complicated topic. You do it sometimes, but not too often. Medieval physicians worried that too much bathing weakened the body. Open pores, they said, invited disease. So kings bathed once a month, maybe, and when they did, it was a public event. The royal tub was dragged into a hall. Water heated in iron cauldrons. Servants poured herbs, sage, rosemary, sometimes ground up pigeon bones, into the bath to make it medicinal. But most days you settle for a sponge rub. If you're lucky, it's a sponge soaked in wine. If you're not, it's a piece of old linen soaked in whatever fluid was closest to the fireplace. And don't even ask about soap. You sweat constantly. Your cloaks are lined with fur. You wear layers, linen under tunics, woolen overrobes, ceremonial sashes, sometimes armour. No one breathes, everyone smells. The nobility have developed the uncanny ability to hold their breath while speaking. The castle is not much better. It's cold, damp and alive with things that shouldn't be alive. Rats skitter in the walls. Fleas nest in the rushes scattered on the floor. You change those rushes maybe twice a year, and even then, only the top layer. The bottom layer is a brown paste of grease, urine, candle drippings and dead bugs. No one talks about the floor, it's a political subject. Then there's your bed. It is technically grand. A massive wooden frame draped in velvet and stuffed with straw. You sleep surrounded by curtains to preserve warmth, which also conveniently trap your body heat, breath, sweat, and occasional flatulence into a damp royal stew. You share this space with lice, lots of them. Lice and fleas were so common among kings that many had ceremonial combs made of ivory, engraved with religious scenes, presumably to make picking nits feel holy. The lice crawl across your scalp at night, whispering tiny curses. You wake up scratching, your fingers red with battle. Your robes are magnificent until you remove them. Underneath, your underclothes are stiff, not from starch but from repeated wear. They've been aired rather than washed. Servants hang them in the wind and hope the weather blesses them clean. You don't notice, you're too busy with court. Every day, dozens of nobles breathe moistly into your personal space to deliver grievances. They kneel, they mutter, they leave behind particles. You receive their words, their germs, and their perfumes. A medieval cocktail that makes your eyes water and your lungs question their purpose. You drink to numb it. Wine is the king's constant companion because water isn't safe. Castle wells are often contaminated. Ale and wine were considered cleaner. So you sip mulled wine with every meal, diluted with honey and herbs. It dulls your senses just enough to tolerate the food, which is frankly appalling. You eat well, in theory, But your food is dangerous. Meat is rarely fresh. It's boiled or roasted until it weeps, then buried in spices to mask decay. You feast on eels, game birds, and pies stuffed with things you cannot identify. Vegetables are for the peasants. You, my liege, are gassy with glory. And then there's your gut. You have what the court physician politely calls royal digestion. This means you often have to excuse yourself. Urgently, explosively. The royal latrine is a stone bench with a hole, suspended over a pit that may or may not connect to the moat. You sit there, crowned and cold, contemplating your sins. No one talks about it. Everyone hears it. The bishop once blessed the privy shaft just to quiet rumours of demonic possession. You survive each day through sheer inertia, by sleeping in layers of your own sweat, eating things that probably walk themselves onto the plate, and ruling over people who are convinced that your odour is holy. And yet you're considered lucky. You're not tilling frozen mud. You're not dying of rat-borne plague. Yet. You're not sleeping in a pig shed. You're the king. You just happen to live in a palace of parasites, stew in your own unwashed silk, and slowly digest your way to an early grave. That's royalty. It's not crowns and clean sheets. It's pus, piety, and politics in equal measure. And as you lie in bed, wrapped in velvet and vinegar, you think to yourself, maybe the peasants had it worse. But at least they could scratch themselves without making it ceremonial. To understand why medieval kings always smelled like wet goose, you first need to surrender any modern assumptions you might have about hygiene. That word, hygiene, didn't mean cleanliness, it meant balance. And in the medieval mind, the goal wasn't to smell nice, but to avoid disturbing the fragile harmony of your bodily humours. So if a king stank to high heaven, that was just equilibrium, with a crown. In theory, the royal body was a vessel of divine order. In practice, it was a half-rotted sausage casing filled with mutton, anxiety, and questionable ointments. The result was not so much a scent as a warning. A king's odour entered the room before he did, and it lingered long after he left. The problem began with bathing, or the lack of it. The medieval medical establishment had made it quite clear. Frequent bathing was dangerous. Hot water opened the skin's pores, which could let in illness, demonic winds, or worse, feminine thoughts. Public bathhouses were tolerated for the poor, but for kings, they were a potential gateway to moral decay. So the crown took the cautious path. One full bath per season. Maybe. When that bath occurred, it was an event. Servants hauled steaming water in buckets. Rose petals were sprinkled on the surface, not for romance, but to mask the fact that the water had been reused by several footmen first. A wooden tub was brought into the royal chamber, flanked by folding screens and scandalised bishops. Herbs were added, sage for strength, thyme for virility, and sometimes crushed marjoram, which was believed to ward off scrofula and melancholy. But even this was rare. Most days kings were cleansed with linen cloth soaked in wine or vinegar. The cloths were reused, of course. A quick wipe to the armpits, groin, neck folds, the so-called holy triangle. That was the extent of your bathing routine, and it showed. Let's talk about clothes. The king's garments were elaborate, ceremonial, and alarmingly porous. Multiple layers were worn year-round, an undertunic of linen, an overtunic of wool or velvet, a surcoat of silk, and a fur-trimmed cloak that hadn't been dry since Advent. Sweat soaked everything. Stains were not removed, only disguised. It was common practice to rub charcoal or ash into discoloured areas to balance them visually. When that failed, a servant simply turned the garment inside out. If anyone noticed, they said nothing. Fur was the worst offender. Popular types included marten, beaver, fox, and ermine. They held onto scent like a vault. Wet fur stinks, but wet fur plus goose fat, which was used to soften the leather and protect against chafing, created a musk that defied poetry. Hence, the king often smelled like wet goose left under a brazier overnight. It became his signature. Now, the king did try to fight back. He had tools. Sachets of dried herbs were sewn into the folds of his robes. Pouches of crushed lavender, wormwood, and orris root hung around his neck. Perfumed gloves, soaked in rose oil and ambergris, were worn during court appearances. Sometimes he'd chew cloves or fennel seeds just to taste clean. But these were band-aids on a boiling cauldron. The reality was, his body never caught up with his office. Even his bed was complicit in the crime. The royal mattress was stuffed with straw and draped in velvet. The sheets were rarely washed, just relayered with more linen and sprinkled with spices. Fleas and lice lived full lives between those sheets, including multiple generations. The crown had its own dedicated louse comb, carved from ivory, which doubled as a political prop during heated debates. You could measure royal stress by how furiously the king scratched, and yet no one dared complain. In fact, scent was often interpreted as status. The nobility did not sweat like commoners. They glistened. They didn't stink. They were ripe with virtue. The smell of meat, wine, and incense baked into one's robes was seen as evidence of holy labour. Peasants were punished for smelling bad. Kings were feared for it. One chronicler described a monarch's presence as overwhelming, like the incense of Jerusalem mixed with bear. Another likened the court to a garden after rain, if the rain were made of gravy. These were compliments, but under the pomp, the royal body was in decay. The worst season was summer. Heat meant sweat, sweat meant odour, and odour meant flies. Courtrooms buzzed, kitchens boiled, cloaks became woolen furnaces. Banquets were held in great halls that doubled as saunas of grease, smoke, and fermented body heat. By midsummer, a typical royal cloak could stand on its own. To fight this, kings relied on what little deodorizing tools they had: vinegar foot baths, wine-soaked kerchiefs, and sometimes carrying live lemons in their sleeves to squeeze discreetly onto their wrists. This didn't work, but it gave the illusion of control. And then came the diplomacy. Because believe it or not, a monarch's scent mattered on the international stage. Visiting nobles judged alliances not just by protocol, but by nose. In some cases, royals gifted perfumed garments or boxes of exotic spices as part of treaty offerings. The stronger the stink, the more likely someone was to hold their breath and agree to your terms. A particularly fragrant monarch was once said to have ended a siege simply by inviting the opposing general to dinner. The general declined. The siege ended. Coincidence? In time, royal stench became myth. Poets whispered of kings whose very sweat cured warts. Chroniclers invented terms like sacred musk. Saints were said to emit the odour of sanctity, a faint floral perfume. Kings attempted to co-opt this by rubbing themselves with myrrh, anointing their feet with oil, and sleeping with relics. It didn't help, but it sounded holy. And that was enough. So why did the king always smell like wet goose? Because he was robed in fat and fear. Because bathing was risky, laundering was violent, and prestige meant never admitting you reeked. Because every square inch of your royal existence was layered with grease, guilt, and the slow perfume of unchecked humanity. And because in a world where your body symbolized your kingdom, what better metaphor could there be than the stench of glory itself? The great hall is silent. A hush has fallen over the nobles, the knights, the trembling pages, and even the dogs curled beneath the benches. All eyes are on the king's plate, specifically the boiled swan stuffed with raisins and regret that is slowly collapsing under its own grease. This, dear viewer, is not just a meal, it's a test. Because for a medieval king, every bite was a gamble, every spoonful a diplomatic landmine, every chew potentially the last. And yet, he eats, because hunger, like power, demands obedience. To dine as a medieval monarch was to experience equal parts luxury and terror. From a distance, royal banquets appeared majestic, glittering goblets, embroidered tablecloths, and golden platters groaning under whole roasted animals. But step closer, and the illusion peels back to reveal a stinking, dangerous buffet of filth. You see, the medieval royal kitchen was less culinary art and more controlled chaos. A team of sweaty cooks, sometimes over 100 in large courts, worked in soot-choked kitchens where boiling cauldrons, open hearths and rat colonies all competed for space. Ventilation was optional, sanitation theoretical. The food? A horror show in silverware. Start with the meat. Meat was a staple of the royal diet, not for nutrition but for status. The king's table boasted venison, wild boar, swan, heron, crane, and, when the mood struck, porpoise. Yes, porpoise. It counted as fish, technically. And because fresh meat didn't stay fresh for long, most of it was aged in the worst possible way. Meat storage involved hanging carcasses in cool rooms, or more commonly mildly shaded corners. The goal was not refrigeration, which didn't exist, but rather to let the meat ferment to peak tenderness. When it smelled just strong enough to sting the nose, it was considered ready. Then came the spices. Lots of spices. Because if your goose reeked of mildew and your beef looked like it had opinions, you doused it in cinnamon, cloves, nutmeg, ginger. Not for flavour, but for concealment. This made things worse. Now your meat smelled like rotten Christmas. Bread was safer, but not by much. The finest bread, manchi, was made from sifted white flour and served to royalty. Coarser breads, baked from rye or barley, went to the lower orders. These were often dense enough to be used as trenchers, edible plates that soaked up gravy, grease, and spilled wine, and were then either eaten, tossed to the poor, or scraped up and recycled into stew. Yes, recycled. No one knew what went into the stew, no one asked. That was the point. But vegetables? Rare. They were considered peasant food, cold and moist in humour, and unsuitable for royal consumption. Garlic was suspicious. Onions were tolerated only when boiled to oblivion. Beans were a last resort. The king's bowels were already at war. Legumes were an act of treason. So what did the king consume most? Meat pies. Massive ones. Medieval meat pies were architectural. Layers of congealed fat, hard pastry, dried fruit, and questionable pigeon. They were designed to last through a siege, and sometimes caused one. Then there was the drink. Water was not an option. Wells were often contaminated with latrine runoff or decomposing rodents. So the king drank wine, copious amounts of it, spiced, diluted, mulled, sometimes boiled with rosemary or peppercorns to kill anything still swimming inside. It worked mostly, except when it didn't. One feast ended in mass food poisoning after the royal butler added spoiled honey to the wine barrel. Another saw the kitchen boy accidentally stir arsenic into the custard. Poisonings were common enough to require designated tasters. They rarely lasted long. Even when the food was safe, it wasn't gentle. Imagine wolfing down half a roast capon stuffed with pork, then finishing with an almond milk pudding laced with crushed dates, and washing it all down with 3 goblets of clove-heavy wine. Then imagine doing this 3 times a day, for years. You don't digest it, you survive it. That's why kings relied on purgatives. Laxatives, emetics, and enemas were all regular parts of court medicine. Royal physicians carried recipes for vomiting powders made from hellebore or antimony. Some kings purged weekly, others simply prayed. Digestive issues were so widespread that farting during council was considered a sign of honesty. And still, despite the danger, the spectacle of eating had to be maintained. Banquets were political theatre. To show wealth, you had to overfeed. Food was carved at the table, often by trained knights, because carving was an act of noble skill. Spoons were shared, napkins were optional. Washing hands before eating was ceremonial. Washing after, a hopeful suggestion. Etiquette guides advised not picking your teeth with your knife in front of the bishop. They did not address what to do when a meatball rolled under the table and returned with a tail. All of this came at a cost: gout, obesity, constipation, explosive diarrhea. One 14th century king was said to have died mid-defecation after a particularly violent roast ox. Another developed a skin condition from overindulging in lamprey eels. And yet the meals continued, because for all its hazards, food was one of the few pleasures left to a king whose life was otherwise dominated by war, disease, and assassination attempts. To feast was to assert life, even if your chicken still had feathers, even if your liver pudding screamed when cut, even if the eels wiggled longer than expected, even then. So the next time you picture a medieval king at dinner, don't imagine a serene figure nibbling grapes from a silver platter. Picture a sweating, belching man seated beneath a dripping boar carcass, surrounded by piles of pastry, and a staff nervously sniffing every goblet before it reaches his hand. Because in a world without refrigeration, food safety, or even forks, every royal meal was a battlefield. And the king, he just hoped to survive to dessert. If you're imagining a royal bedroom as a sanctuary of luxury, plush pillows, silk sheets, and the gentle scent of lavender wafting from a velvet-draped bed, it's time to wake up. Because in a medieval castle, the king's bedchamber wasn't a place of rest. It was a battlefield. A lumpy, lice-ridden, infection-prone swamp of wool, sweat, insects, and spiritual confusion, where the only thing worse than being awake was trying to fall asleep. Let's begin with the bed itself. It was admittedly large. That part is true. Royal beds were status symbols, elevated on wooden frames so high they often required a stool or a helpful footman just to climb in. They were surrounded by thick curtains meant to keep out drafts, retain heat, and offer privacy. But here's the first problem. Heat doesn't discriminate. Those heavy curtains did trap warmth, but they also trapped moisture, breath, farts, fleas, and the collective damp of two humans marinating in wool for 8 to 10 hours. You didn't so much sleep in a medieval bed, you stewed in it. The mattress itself was stuffed with straw, feathers, or, if you were unlucky, dried moss. Over time, the stuffing settled into uneven lumps, often harbouring mould, rodents, or what one French courtier described delicately as midnight parasites. These parasites were well documented. Lice, fleas, mites, bedbugs, all thrived in the medieval bed. Combs were issued to royal valets not just for grooming, but for nit hunting. Bed curtains were beaten with paddles in the morning to knock out the larger bugs. Smaller ones had to be picked manually. And the sheets, they were rarely washed. Linen was precious. Washing it involved labour, boiling and prayer. So instead, sheets were aired, hung over castle balconies or beside the kitchen fire to dry out the king's humours. This accomplished very little, aside from allowing birds to contribute their own opinions from above. Now let's discuss what the king wore to bed. Not much. Medieval nightwear for men typically consisted of a linen shift, essentially a long shirt, or, in some cases, nothing at all. The idea was to let the body breathe, though in a room heated only by proximity to a torch and a chambermaid's resentment, this often resulted in blue feet and frostbitten buttocks. Still, nudity was tolerated because it was believed that sleep was a spiritual act. This is important. Sleep was seen not as a biological necessity, but a vulnerable state of moral exposure. It was during sleep that demons could enter the body, which is why kings often slept with holy relics under their pillows, a finger bone of a saint, a splinter of the true cross, or even a dried rose blessed by a bishop. These relics offered divine protection. They did not, however, repel lice. Then there was the matter of company. The king did not sleep alone. not necessarily for romantic reasons, but for logistical ones. Royal bedchambers were often shared with attendants, scribes, or favoured courtiers. Some kings shared beds with their closest advisors as a show of trust, others with their confessor. Some simply needed help rolling over in the night due to weight, gout, or ceremonial layering. And yet privacy was still insisted upon, which led to the strange phenomenon of the whisper wall, a curtain within a curtain, separating the king from his fellow bedfellows with little more than a moral suggestion and a layer of moth-eaten velvet. Of course, these curtains didn't block sound. Everyone still heard everything, especially when the king snored, a deep royal snore that echoed through the hallways like a wounded ox trapped in a cathedral. Let's talk about nighttime relief, because even kings have bladders. Royal bedchambers were equipped with chamber pots, large ceramic bowls placed under the bed or beside it. At night, the king would relieve himself into one of these, often without leaving the covers. Servants were tasked with emptying the pot before sunrise. Sometimes they forgot, other times the pot cracked from cold. In both cases, the consequences were unspeakable. The smell of a poorly managed chamber pot could seep into bed linens and remain there for weeks, no matter how much rosewater or myrrh was applied. Some kings tried to mask the scent by sleeping with a pomander, a hollow orb filled with herbs and dried flowers, pressed to their nose. Many preferred suffocation. And what about illness? Nighttime was when it crept in. Fevers burned higher after dark. Sweating sickness, gout, dysentery, all intensified between the hours of candle snuffing and rooster crow. Physicians believed that evil spirits entered through the nostrils at night, which led to the widespread practice of stuffing the nose with garlic or dried rosemary before sleep. This did nothing, but it kept demons and bed partners at bay. Then there were the dreams. Kings dreamed often, and because they were kings, those dreams were considered important. Entire councils were held to interpret royal dreams. If the king dreamt of wolves, it meant treachery. If he dreamt of flying, it meant divine favour. If he dreamt of swimming in a vat of goose grease, which happened often, it meant indigestion. These dreams were recorded, analysed, even used to justify war. So when the king thrashed in his bed, tangled in wool and ghosts, it was not seen as discomfort. It was prophecy. And yet, despite the rituals, the relics, and the prayerful linens, the bedchamber remained a horror. By winter, the cold turned every sheet into parchment. By summer, the sweat turned every blanket into a slip and slide of misery. One 13th century monarch reportedly refused to sleep for 3 days because his sheets had been possessed by mildew. Another ordered his mattress replaced after a flea bite swelled into something large enough to be named. But no matter how many new furs were laid, or saints' bones placed beneath the pillow, the bugs always came back. The damp never left. And the king, ruler of 1,000 souls, could do nothing but scratch, fart, and try to sleep through the buzzing itch of sovereignty. So next time you imagine a medieval king slumbering in luxury, erase the silk sheets from your mind. Replace them with sweat-stiffened linen, lice colonies in the pillow seams, and a bed frame that creaks with every pained roll. Because for all the power in his realm, the medieval king could never conquer one thing: his own bed. There's a reason it's called the throne. But it's not what you think. In the medieval castle, the throne wasn't just a symbol of royal power. It was also, quite literally, a seat over a hole. A heavy wooden bench with an opening cut into it, positioned above a pit deep enough to offend geology, and used for one sacred, unrelenting purpose: to relieve the king. Because when you're consuming gallons of spiced wine, 3 species of roasted bird, and the entire contents of your own private orchard, something has to give. And that something, unfortunately, is your dignity. Let's begin with the medieval garderobe. That's the polite term. It comes from the old French garda, to guard, and robe, clothing. Because, stay with us, people believed that hanging clothes near the toilet warded off lice and moths. Something about the ammonia rising from waste was thought to be lethal to insects. They were not wrong, but it also meant that every royal robe came with a faint whiff of fecal vapour. Fashion has always been about suffering. The royal garderobe was typically located in a small chamber off the side of the castle, either cantilevered out over the moat or placed above a stone chute leading to a cesspit below. This pit was sometimes a trench, sometimes a barrel, and sometimes, horrifyingly, the kitchen garden. Waste dropped through the hole and into the void, where it lingered in the moist darkness, occasionally bubbling up in the summer months to remind everyone what monarchy truly smelled like. These chutes were rarely cleaned. Servants called gong farmers were hired to scoop out the waste using shovels, buckets, and a healthy sense of denial. It was dangerous work. The fumes could overwhelm you, the walls could collapse, and yes, more than a few unlucky individuals died by falling into the pit. Some of them were never found. Now imagine being the king. You've just finished a 4-hour feast involving stuffed peacock, clove-laced custard, and a suspiciously fizzy tankard of wine. You wobble your way to the privy chamber. A servant opens the curtain. A second lights a candle. A third bows and hands you a linen square that's been used more times than anyone cares to count. You sit, and the real ceremony begins. Because going to the toilet was not a private affair for kings, it was a state event. Most monarchs had a designated groom of the stool, a trusted courtier whose job was, and this is not a joke, to manage the king's bowel movements. He kept records of consistency, texture, and timing. He offered encouragement. He held the scented cloths. He was quite literally the king's closest confidant. And somehow, this was a position of honour. The groom of the stool had access to the king at his most vulnerable. He was privy, yes, that's the origin, to secrets, mood swings, and digestive trends. Several grooms went on to become powerful advisors. Others retired with pensions and lifelong titles. History has a cruel sense of humour. The throne itself was functional, if unsettling. A wide wooden seat with an oval opening, sometimes padded with cloth, sometimes carved with decorative flourishes. Below the opening, the void. In winter, it was cold enough to stun your bladder into silence. In summer, it was an olfactory crime scene. There were no flushes, no privacy. Only the hope that whatever lived down there was currently asleep. And yet, the king was expected to carry himself with grace, to defecate regally, to emerge from the chamber with a serene face and a clean conscience. This was difficult, especially during bouts of illness, which were frequent. Dysentery, parasites, food poisoning, and the flux, a charming term for uncontrollable diarrhea, were rampant. Royal doctors prescribed everything from boiled mint tea to powdered horn to corks. Yes, corks. For blocking. They didn't work. Even worse, these toilet chambers were structurally unsound. Stone chutes cracked, wooden beams rotted, entire garderobes collapsed without warning. One German king fell through his privy mid-ceremony and broke 3 ribs. A Hungarian noble disappeared into a castle moat while relieving himself, only to re-emerge hours later, covered in algae and political embarrassment. One of the most famous deaths in medieval sanitation history, King Wenceslaus III, who was allegedly stabbed in the privy by an assassin hiding below. It's apocryphal, yes, but plausible. The idea of a dagger from the darkness while pants are down was a very real fear. Some monarchs insisted on guards outside the door. Others installed false seats, decoys, to test for traitors. You can't be too careful when your most vulnerable state happens on a wooden bench over an open pit. And then there were the smells. The entire castle reeked. Waste soaked into walls. Ammonia hung in the stairwells. Moisture carried scents through the stone corridors like an angry ghost. Visitors often covered their faces with scented cloths. Incense was burned around the clock. Rushes and herbs were strewn across the floors, not for decoration, but to absorb fluids and odours. They needed to be changed weekly. They were changed quarterly. By the time guests arrived for a feast, the scent of royal dignity had already marinated into the flagstones. Despite all this, kings were proud of their guardrobes. They bragged about them. Some castles had multiple toilets, others had twin-seaters. One French monarch had his privy painted with religious iconography, so he could contemplate salvation while contemplating digestion. That was the idea. To elevate the act. To frame bowel movements as divine release. But make no mistake, the reality was bleak. You perched on a splintered plank, sweating in layers of fur, your crown resting awkwardly on the hook beside you, while rats shuffled beneath your feet and a servant waited to hand you the cloth. The throne room wasn't a place of power. It was a place of consequence. So the next time someone tells you they want to live like royalty, ask them this. Are you prepared to lower your bare backside onto a worm-eaten bench above a pit of medieval secrets? Can you stare into the abyss and wipe with reused linen while a nobleman takes notes? Can you rule a kingdom from the one seat no one dares challenge? Because in the Middle Ages, being king didn't mean escaping filth. It meant sitting on top of it. There are few things more dangerous in a medieval castle than a king with a stomachache. Not because of the pain, though royal indigestion was often its own form of divine wrath, but because once a monarch complained of discomfort, the royal physician was summoned, and when that happened, all bets were off. Because in the Middle Ages, the most powerful man in the kingdom could still find himself lying on a cold wooden slab, his wrists pale from bloodletting, his body smeared with mustard poultices, and a dozen leeches clinging lovingly to his thighs. This wasn't medicine, this was ritual, and it had a body count. Let's begin with the physician himself. Royal doctors were not always medically trained. In fact, most weren't. A handful might have studied in Paris or Salerno, but the majority were educated in monasteries, where treatments leaned heavily on saints, astrology, and boiled herbs. Credentials were less important than confidence. To be a king's doctor, you didn't need a degree. You needed nerve. You had to walk into a hall full of knights, bishops, and courtiers and declare that your sovereign's hiccups were caused by an imbalance in phlegm. Then suggest a solution that involved warm wine and pigeon dung, and somehow, be taken seriously. At the core of medieval medicine was the theory of the four humours: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. Every illness, from boils to heartbreak, was believed to be the result of these fluids falling out of balance. Too much black bile, you were melancholic. Too much phlegm, sluggish and pale. Too much blood, that was the worst. That meant you were hot-blooded, feverish, and, according to the medical manuals, probably prone to lust and outbursts, which was unfortunate because kings were always hot-blooded, so they were bled. Frequently, bloodletting was both diagnosis and cure. You didn't just show symptoms, you spilled them. The royal physician would arrive with a velvet case filled with shiny knives, glass cups, and a small damp bag of leeches. Each tool had a purpose. The leeches were for drawing blood from delicate areas. The knives were for veins. The cups for cupping. A process where heated glass was applied to the skin to draw blood to the surface. None of this was sterilised. The same leech might visit 3 patients in a day. Blades were wiped on cloth. Cups were rinsed in ale. And yet this was considered cutting-edge treatment. The king would be made to lie still while blood was drawn from his arms, ankles, or, if things were truly dire, behind the ears. Some kings were bled once a week as preventative care. Others bled until they passed out. If they survived, it meant the treatment had worked. If they died, well, they clearly had too much blood. But leeches were only the beginning. The royal doctor carried a grim catalogue of remedies. Powders made from crushed gemstones, dried wolf liver, boiled lily root. Some recipes called for burned toad skin mixed with honey. Others demanded human urine, usually aged 3 days, stirred with goat's milk and applied to the chest. This was believed to cure coughing. It often cured guests of their appetite. Then there were enemas. Kings received them regularly. Administered by a special servant using a brass syringe, enemas were believed to flush out impurities and rebalance the humours from below. The procedure was performed in the royal bedchamber, sometimes mid-meeting. A screen might be raised, incense was burned. But make no mistake, everyone heard it. Medieval records include entire schedules of enema regimens for royal patients, with recipes involving warm oil, chamomile, and occasionally, for extra cleansing, wine. No one dared laugh, at least not until they left the room. If the king developed a rash, it was blamed on the stars. Astrology was crucial to diagnosis. Physicians consulted charts to determine the best time to lance a boil or trim a toenail. If Mars was in retrograde, they might postpone treatment entirely. Mercury in Leo, avoid purgatives. Jupiter ascending, excellent for dental work. Your bowels were held hostage by the cosmos, and heaven help you if the moon was full. Despite all this, kings trusted their doctors. They had no choice, and to be fair, some physicians genuinely tried to help. They catalogued symptoms, they recorded outcomes, they adjusted prescriptions based on the patient's temperament. A few even kept detailed notes, now preserved in dusty manuscripts with names like the Physic of Lords or the Garden of Health. But most were just guessing with sharp tools and strong opinions. Sometimes the treatment made things worse. Fevered kings were wrapped in boiling blankets. Wounds were packed with butter and hair. Coughing fits were cured with mercury. Toothaches? You either had the tooth pulled with iron pliers or had hot onion paste stuffed into your ear canal until something gave. It was not a gentle process, and yet kings endured it, because the alternative was worse. To refuse treatment was to invite whispers. Was the king cursed, possessed, punished by God? Sickness was not just physical, it was political. A weak monarch inspired rebellion. A vomiting monarch sparked prayers, rumours, and at least one assassination attempt from a rival duke who thought the leeching wouldn't work this time. It did. Barely. So the next time you complain about waiting in a modern clinic, imagine this. You, lying shirtless in a stone chamber that smells like wet ash and old feet, while a man with a robe and a leech pouch squints at your tongue, checks the moon chart and mutters that your bile is looking moody. Then he tells you to drink warm vinegar, eat no bread, and hold a chicken egg under your arm for 3 days. Because in his expert opinion, you're probably too alive. In the grand tapestry of medieval monarchy, woven with gold thread stained with gravy and lightly scorched by candle accidents, few symbols mattered more than the royal beard. It was a sign of virility, wisdom, and command. But beneath the curls and oils, it was also a mobile ecosystem, because when it came to facial hair, medieval kings didn't just grow beards, they farmed them. They cultivated great, glistening, gravity-defying thickets of hair, sometimes braided, sometimes bejeweled, and always, always infested with life. To be clear, kings were expected to have beards. Clean-shaven men were often regarded with suspicion, associated with monks, eunuchs, or foreign diplomats who couldn't be trusted not to weep into their soup. A beard meant strength, maturity, divine favour. It also meant warmth, a necessity in stone-walled castles where the wind could whistle through your bedchamber like a mourning ghost. The beard functioned as insulation, both physical and political. The bigger the beard, the more serious your reign, and some took that very seriously indeed. Records describe beards so long they were tucked into belts, braided with ribbons, or fluffed with goose fat for ceremonial stiffness. Entire coat of arms were designed to highlight facial hair. One royal seal showed a king's beard cascading like a waterfall of tangled hay. But with great bearding came great consequences. First, the smell. A royal beard lived in the same sensory battlefield as the rest of the medieval body, surrounded by fire smoke, stale wine, unwashed skin, and occasional vomiting. Meals were eaten with fingers, goblets were shared, napkins were a suggestion. So food, particularly gravies, potages, and bits of roasted fowl, tended to linger. Kings could walk out of a feast with a duck wing lodged in their sideburns and not realise it until morning. Crumbs built up over time, dried sauces hardened, and the beard, once proud and flowing, began to take on the properties of a seasoned skillet. You didn't clean it, you re-seasoned it. Now, let's address the wildlife. Fleas, lice, and nits were part of royal life, not because kings were especially dirty, though they were, but because the medieval world crawled with things. People lived close together, furs were rarely washed, shared bedding was standard, and when lice found a warm, fuzzy nook to nest in, they didn't ask for permission. The royal beard was perfect, software dense, frequently damp, which is why court barbers were tasked not only with trimming the royal beard but delousing it. Combs were made of ivory or bone, carved with meticulous teeth, and used daily, or at least weekly, to scrape through the foliage and remove unwanted guests. These sessions could last hours. They were intimate, political, sometimes even spiritual. A trusted barber was as valuable as a doctor, because no one wanted to see the king scratching himself like a flea-ridden badger during mass. But despite best efforts, infestations persisted, and sometimes they flourished. At least once, a royal beard had to be shaved entirely due to maggoty intrusion. Another monarch insisted on smearing his beard with a mixture of vinegar and crushed rosemary every morning to ward off the creeping crawl. The results were mixed, but more often than not the beard stayed, because shaving it would mean weakness. A beardless king was vulnerable, symbolically and literally. In times of mourning or penance, kings might be shaved as a gesture of humility. But even then, it was controversial. One chronicler described such a moment as the most naked he hath appeared since baptism. The court gasped. Of course, hygiene was attempted, beards were washed, occasionally. This involved warm water, a cloth, and perhaps a handful of soap made from animal fat and lye. This soap stung. It left skin raw. It smelled like burnt barn. But it did technically remove filth, assuming the servant applying it hadn't already used the cloth to wipe the windows. Some kings scented their beards with herbs, lavender, marjoram, rue and wormwood. Others perfumed the air around them instead, carrying pomanders or placing incense beneath their thrones. Still, the beard absorbed everything, and by the end of the day it bore witness to soup, sweat, arguments, crumbs and coronations. It also bore witness to ambition, because beards were not just decorative, they were political weapons. Portraits emphasized them, poets praised them, enemies mocked them. To be accused of having a thin beard was an insult to your lineage. To lose your beard in battle, singed, cut or forcibly shaved, was tantamount to losing your crown. One rival king was known to insult foreign rulers by sending them ribbons for their wives' chins. Another paid a man to grow a beard larger than the king's, then publicly humiliated him for the comparison. It was beard warfare, with fleas. In time, the royal beard became less fashionable. Renaissance styles shifted toward clean-shaven chins and neatly trimmed goatees. Barbers became stylists. Flea combs were replaced by perfumes. But for centuries, particularly the darkest ones, the beard was king. And it was disgusting, soft on the outside, festering on the inside, a mixture of masculine pride and old gravy. It twitched when you spoke, it clung to your goblet, It turned up days later as a crust on your collar, but it was yours, a badge of manhood, a royal nest of secrets. So the next time you picture a medieval king, don't stop at the crown. Zoom in, see the breadcrumbs, the lice, the tufts of old lamb shank tangled near the jaw. Smell the clove oil failing to mask 3-day-old pigeon stew. Watch the barber comb through it with a wince. And remember, this wasn't just facial hair, this was a kingdom unto itself, and it ruled with an itchy, stinking fist. You'd think a king's greatest fear might be assassination, a poisoned goblet, a dagger in the shadows, a rebellious noble rising in the night. But no, in some courts the real nightmare was far more intimate. It was the moment late at night after the banquet, after the priest's blessings and the final toast, when the royal boots came off. Because hidden beneath the velvet robes, beneath the ceremonial hose and embroidered stockings, were the most feared objects in the royal bedchamber. The king's feet. Let's start with the shoes. Medieval royal footwear was designed to impress, not protect. Kings wore pointed leather slippers, sometimes so long and curled they had to be tied to the knees with little gold chains. The longer the toe, the more powerful the man. It was a strange logic, but one the nobles embraced with enthusiasm and corns. These shoes were made from untanned leather, lined with wool or rabbit fur, and decorated with embroidery, pearls, or even gemstones. They looked magnificent in portraits. In real life, they were damp sponges strapped to your foot. They weren't waterproof. They weren't breathable. They weren't even consistent in size. A left shoe might fit differently from a right. An arch support was a fantasy no one had yet invented. But the king wore them anyway, for hours, in parades, at feasts, through rain and snow, sometimes through entire religious festivals that lasted days without a single change of clothes. And inside those shoes, a moist, ungoverned swamp of skin. You see, medieval kings didn't wash their feet regularly. Foot washing was reserved for Lent, or symbolic acts of humility, like washing a poor man's feet in front of the court once a year. That was seen as spiritual. Washing your own feet? That was indulgent, suspicious, possibly sinful. So instead the royal feet simmered in their own juices. Toenails thickened, skin cracked, blisters bloomed and popped beneath layers of bandage and fur. Calluses grew into barnacles. Fungus took hold. Corns hardened into pebble-sized lumps that required knives to remove. Some kings developed open sores that never healed, just dried into scabs that stuck to the wool. Others had what we'd now recognise as trench foot, a pulpy, white, stinking condition caused by prolonged exposure to wet leather and friction. The smell was legendary. Chroniclers wrote of a scent that parted courtiers like the Red Sea. Now imagine sharing a bed with this. Royal marriages weren't known for romance to begin with, but nothing quite dried up the marital mood like a monarch peeling off his boots and releasing a decade's worth of foot fog into the bedchamber. There are records of queens moving into separate rooms, citing the bodily odour of the royal extremities as a form of cruelty. Others insisted on incense burners placed at the foot of the bed. One particularly brave duchess had a special screen erected, not for privacy but for airflow management. Still, the boots had to come off sometime, usually with the help of a servant. This poor soul, the royal footman in the most literal sense, was tasked with unstrapping the buckles, peeling back the layers, and sometimes prying the toes apart if they'd fused slightly during the day. They did not get paid enough. And then there were the treatments. Because even kings had limits. When the pain grew unbearable, when the bunions pulsed like volcanoes and the fungal itch reached cathedral levels, the physician was summoned. What followed was a medieval pedicure. Hot water, herbs like sage and thyme, a sprinkle of vinegar, and a foot bath carved from solid wood. The king would soak his feet while the physician applied ointments made from pig fat, mustard seed, and powdered toad bone. Then came the scraping, dead skin was removed with knives, calluses were pared down, ingrown nails were extracted using iron tongs, no anaesthetic, just a goblet of wine and a nearby chamber pot in case of screaming. If infection had set in, leeches might be applied to draw out the bad blood, and if the situation was truly dire, the foot was cauterized with a hot iron. This was the gentle treatment. Of course, none of this prevented recurrence, because the boots always went back on. The court demanded appearances, processions, public penance walks through the muddy streets. Shoes were never allowed to fit properly. That would suggest weakness. And besides, no one wanted to see the royal toes. There were limits to devotion. By the end of a king's life, his feet often resembled gnarled roots more than human limbs. Some were twisted from arthritis. Others were clubbed from years of untreated injury. One monarch required his slippers to be custom laced because his toes had fused into a solid mass of bone and horn. Another had to be carried on a litter after a toe became so infected it split open mid-ceremony. But through it all, the illusion remained. Because no matter how foul the smell, how painful the steps, or how loud the squelch after rain, the king walked tall. He limped with dignity, and his courtiers bowed as the scent of sovereignty wafted past. So the next time you picture a medieval king standing triumphantly atop a battlement, sword raised, banners flapping in the wind, pause. Now imagine the puddle forming inside his left boot, the squish as he shifts weight, the faint, unmistakable reek of power and penicillin's absence, because beneath every golden robe was a disaster waiting to be laced up. You might think that being a medieval king meant living at the top of the world, and in a sense you'd be right, because the king's chambers were almost always at the top of the tallest tower in the castle, up a spiral staircase that could break your ankle, twist your knee, knock out your teeth, and end your lineage all before breakfast. Welcome to royal architecture, where every step was a hazard, and gravity had a personal vendetta. Castles weren't designed with comfort in mind. They were fortresses, built to keep enemies out, not to keep kings upright. Spiral staircases curled tightly, often clockwise, deliberately disorienting attackers. Why? Because most people were right-handed. A defender descending the stairs would have room to swing his sword. An attacker going up would slam his weapon into the central column. Strategic, yes, but try climbing it after a feast of salted lamprey, 6 goblets of clove wine, and a leg cramp that's been brewing since Pentecost. You didn't ascend those stairs, you survived them. The steps themselves were uneven by design. Some were short, some tall, some tilted slightly inward. Others were worn smooth by centuries of panicked feet. Add in poor lighting, or no lighting at all, and you had a recipe for disaster. Torches flickered in sconces, casting shadows that danced like demons on the wall. In winter, those same stairs could be coated in frost. In summer, pigeon droppings. All year round, they hosted the droppings of servants, chamber pots, and occasionally drunk nobility. Handrails? Don't be ridiculous. You had a wall on one side and open space on the other. If your slipper caught the edge, or your gouty foot gave out halfway up, you were going for a ride. And that ride didn't end softly. Many kings fell on those stairs. Some broke ribs, some broke teeth. One monarch reportedly cracked his skull and continued ruling with a dented crown for the next 7 years. Another tumbled during a late-night bathroom run and woke up in a wine barrel 3 levels down. 'Cause here's the thing. There were no elevators, no ramps, not even rope ladders. If you were king and you wanted to get anywhere in your own castle, chapel, hall, battlements, dungeon, you were climbing, in full robes, sometimes in armour, sometimes with an entire entourage trailing behind, each person whispering prayers and watching the royal ankles twist with divine tension. Now let's factor in the animals. Castles weren't just filled with humans. They were full of dogs, cats, horses, chickens, all wandering freely. A royal greyhound might be napping mid-step. A servant's goose might panic and bolt between your legs. Pigeons nested in the rafters and rained droppings from above like feathery artillery. And yes, at least one king was famously startled by a swooping owl and tripped down 4 flights in front of the French ambassador. Diplomacy never recovered. Stairs were also where business happened. There was no such thing as a private office. A noble might catch the king mid-ascent to beg for a favour. A bishop might block his descent with news of a heretic. And if the chamberlain had urgent gossip, he'd deliver it halfway up, huffing like a bellows, while the king balanced on a step slick with candle wax. Many royal arguments began on stairs. Some ended there too. One medieval noble was shoved down the spiral by a rival. Another faked a tumble to avoid attending a wedding. And a few, history suggests, were pushed intentionally, their screams echoing through the stone like divine judgment. Stairs didn't just test your reign, sometimes they ended it. Now you might be wondering why not build better ones. The answer is simple: symbolism. The higher the king, the more powerful he appeared. Placing royal quarters at the top reinforced social hierarchy. You looked up to the crown, literally. Visitors ascended as a sign of submission, and if they died of exhaustion halfway there, well, that just meant they weren't worthy. Besides, staircases doubled as defensive traps. If invaders stormed the castle, those same twisting passages slowed them down. Arrows could be fired from murder holes above, stones dropped, boiling oil poured. The stairs were both access and obstacle, and they worked equally well on friend and foe, including the king. Of course, no one ever admitted this out loud. In royal chronicles, stair injuries were blamed on ill omens, divine chastisement, or a sudden trembling of the earth. Never clumsiness, never poor lighting, never pigeon droppings. That would have been embarrassing. Instead, bruises were wrapped in silence. And the king climbed again the next morning, robes tucked up, teeth clenched, muttering something about treachery and balance. By the twilight of his reign, a monarch's knees were often so ruined from stair duty that he had to be carried, on a litter, by servants, up and down his own castle like a sack of gouty flour. This wasn't shameful, it was expected. Because power, in the medieval mind, was something you climbed for, step by step, spiral by spiral, blister by blister. So the next time someone romanticizes castle life, show them a picture of a narrow stone spiral staircase slick with moss, tilting to the left, lit by a candle the size of a thumb, and echoing with the growls of a hungry hunting dog below. Then imagine doing that at 3 a.m. with indigestion, in a robe. Because if you wanted to be king in the Middle Ages, you didn't just have to win battles, you had to survive your own staircase. You may have heard that medieval people didn't bathe. This is not entirely true. Kings did bathe, just not often, not safely, and certainly not without a small army of assistants, boiling buckets, and a backup priest on hand in case the bath turned fatal. Because royal hygiene wasn't about staying clean, it was about surviving the water, and sometimes they didn't. Let's start with the tub. A royal bath was a grand production. The tub itself was usually made of wood, oak, elm or ash, bound with iron hoops and lined with linen or fur for comfort. Occasionally, a monarch might have a copper tub, though this often led to a delightful metallic aftertaste on the skin. These tubs were rarely located near a fire. Because medieval castles weren't designed for convenience, they were designed for warfare and draftiness. So the bath was dragged into the great hall, or placed in a drafty chamber, or, in one infamous case, set beside an open window for the cleansing power of God's breeze. Water was heated in cauldrons over open flames and carted in by servants in steaming buckets. It took anywhere from 12 to 30 buckets just to fill the tub halfway. The process could take hours. Meanwhile, the bath cooled rapidly, so more buckets were added, some hot, some tepid, some just forgotten by distracted footmen. Temperature control was a guess. Which brings us to the boiling incident. One unfortunate king, name politely redacted by medieval chroniclers, stepped into his ceremonial bath during a spring purification rite and immediately shrieked like a goose being exercised. The water had been overheated, not by much, but enough. His foot was scalded, his inner thigh blistered. The bath was abandoned, the servants blamed, and the royal physician summoned to pray the heat out. Treatment included vinegar compresses, whispered apologies, and 2 leeches, though no one knew why. From that day forward, a tester towel was dropped into the bath first. If it didn't sizzle, the king proceeded. Safety first. But even when temperatures were tolerable, the bath itself was not exactly relaxing. You didn't bathe alone. A full staff was required. Servants to pour, to hold scented cloths, to scrub, to record the water temperature using fingers, and sometimes to read aloud from scripture or poetry while the king soaked. Bathing was considered a moral act, not a private one. You were purifying the body and by extension the soul. But as with all medieval things, the soul had to wait its turn behind parasites and skin rashes. The bathwater wasn't just water, it was a potion. Into the tub went herbs, rosemary, sage, lavender, marjoram and mint, not just for scent, but because they were believed to draw out illness and ward off evil spirits. Sometimes wine was added, sometimes milk. On one occasion a tub was filled with ale for restorative bubbling. That experiment did not end well. One chronicler described the aftermath as foamy treason. The king, once seated, would be scrubbed with linen cloths dipped in warm water and vinegar. The scrubbing was vigorous, the belief being that dirt wasn't just physical but moral. A rash, a bruise, that was evidence of sin. You had to scrub it out. Soap, if used, was homemade, a harsh concoction of animal fat and lye that stripped not only grease, but also dignity and the top layer of skin. After the scrubbing, the king was doused with clean water, sometimes scented, sometimes not. Drying required at least 2 attendants, a dozen towels, and the patience of a monk. And then came the oil, because you couldn't leave a medieval bath dry-skinned. Olive oil, almond oil, goose fat, or even bear grease was massaged into the royal limbs to seal in the purity and prevent cracking. This had the side effect of turning the king into a walking roast. Dust stuck to him. Pet hair clung. On warm days, flies hovered lovingly in his wake. But he was clean. Sort of. Unfortunately, cleanliness didn't last. Most kings bathed only a few times per year. 4 was average. 1 was common. Some bathed only on high holy days, Easter, Pentecost and Christmas, while others added a few bonus soakings during Lent, assuming they hadn't injured themselves on the stairs. This wasn't laziness, it was science. Doctors warned that frequent bathing opened the pores to disease. One physician advised against washing the chest more than twice a year, lest the lungs become slippery. Another claimed that too much warm water made the brain soggy. So the royal bath, when it happened, was both a luxury and a risk. A sacred gamble. The aftermath was awkward. You couldn't just get dressed. The king was bundled in layers of linen and left to air dry for up to an hour, while courtiers pretended not to notice the sound of squelching beneath the robe. During this time, no one was allowed to speak of politics, taxes, or military failures. The king was in purification, which meant he was mildly translucent, vaguely itchy, and extremely slippery. Only after his body had returned to a safe level of dryness was he permitted to re-enter court life, at which point he usually put on the same wool tunic he'd worn before the bath, and the cycle began again. So before you fantasize about a royal soak, candlelight steam, servants, remind yourself that in medieval times, bathing was a high-stakes, low-frequency ordeal involving boiling buckets, bear grease, airborne prayers, and a very real chance of permanent scalding. because being king didn't mean you smelled good. It just meant more people had to pretend you did. To dine like a medieval king was to consume the most decadent, bizarre, and sometimes outright dangerous combinations of food ever assembled in one hall. It meant roasted swans with their feathers reattached, pies stuffed with live birds, custards made of marrow and eggs, and cheese, so much cheese, because while royalty may have worn gold and ruled with iron, they digested like terrified goats, and the royal bowels were, more often than not, the site of a quiet and painful rebellion. Let's set the table. Medieval royal feasts weren't casual affairs. They were declarations of dominance, a chance to flaunt wealth, crush rivals with abundance, and publicly risk gout in front of hundreds. A standard meal for a king could include multiple courses, each with 6 to 10 dishes. Roasted peacock served in its own skin, stewed eel in almond milk, tarts filled with pork fat, dried fruit and saffron, entire boars, heads glazed and stuffed with spiced breadcrumbs, and of course cheese wheels the size of small battle drums. There was no real concept of a balanced diet. Vegetables were seen as food for peasants. Fruit was suspect unless cooked. Meat, fat and dairy reigned supreme. The heavier, the better. And yet, for all its glory, the royal diet was a ticking time bomb. Because digestion, that was the king's secret war. Let's start with the meat. Red meat was believed to heat the body. According to medieval humoral theory, this was a good thing, unless you were already choleric, in which case it made you angry and yellow. So the king naturally ignored this and ate roast venison until his veins cried out for mercy. Most meat was boiled, roasted, or heavily spiced, not to enhance flavour, but to mask the fact that it was already decomposing. Refrigeration didn't exist. Salt was precious. Time was rarely on anyone's side. Thus food poisoning was just another part of court life. If the king threw up mid-feast, the musicians played louder. If he fainted, it was blamed on divine ecstasy. Now the cheese. Ah yes, cheese in the Middle Ages was everywhere. Soft, hard, blue, runny, boiled, baked, and sometimes riddled with more life than a beehive. It was seen as noble food, rich, fatty, fermented. The stronger the smell, the more prestigious the bite. But here's the thing, cheese was lethal. Not immediately, no. But over time, the build-up of poorly digested dairy, combined with mountains of bread and gallons of wine, led to chronic constipation, bloating, and intestinal obstruction. Kings were routinely described in chronicles as visibly distended, unmoving in posture, or simply troubled below. A feast might end in celebration, but the next morning, the throne became the other kind of battlefield, and that's assuming the food even reached the bowels. Because medieval cooking methods didn't exactly promote smooth digestion. Everything was heavy. Butter-thick stews, potted meats, rich gravies poured over everything. Spices like cloves, cinnamon and pepper were added in obscene amounts. Not for flavour balance, but because they were expensive and excess was the point. A single royal pie might include over a dozen different animals, stacked in layers like edible taxidermy. Bones were not always removed. One king reportedly cracked a molar on a pigeon femur baked into his goose pâté. He finished the meal anyway. To leave food was an insult to God, and to the cook, who was often watching with a meat cleaver. Of course, gluttony had its costs. Royal physicians began compiling entire manuals dedicated to the management of kingly digestion. These included such pearls of wisdom as chew each bite at least 30 times, drink hot wine between courses to melt the grease, nap in a seated position so the food doesn't rise into the lungs, and if all else fails, purge violently at dawn and start again. Some kings followed these guidelines, others ate until their stomachs swelled visibly beneath their robes, then demanded a third pudding and a basin for preemptive emptying. This was not rare, it was etiquette. Bowels became political. A constipated king was a cranky king. One monarch famously postponed a war council for 3 days because he couldn't move his bowels. Another blamed a failed treaty negotiation on digestive torments. A third died on the toilet clutching his abdomen, reportedly mid-grimace. He was buried with honour and 6 pounds of undigested lamb. Yet despite the consequences, the feasting never stopped. Because food was power. The more exotic, the better. Roasted dolphin, not a metaphor. Powdered unicorn horn, definitely a metaphor. Candied pine cones soaked in rosewater, and a soup made entirely from cow's udders and almond paste. All washed down with wine so sweet it stuck to your gums. The king was expected to indulge. To deny food was to deny status, even if it meant nightly visits from the royal enema team. And still, perhaps most terrifying of all, the kitchen never closed. There was always a pie baking, a meat roasting, a cheese sweating quietly on a platter the size of a cartwheel. If the king stirred at midnight, someone brought snacks. If he coughed, he was offered cured ham. If he sighed with the weight of the realm, a servant appeared with goose liver on toast and a goblet of honeyed claret. You didn't need to be hungry to eat. You needed to be royal. So the next time someone tells you they'd love to feast like a king, tell them about the cheese. The sweating, oozing, angry cheese that clotted your bowels like cement. Tell them about the wine that dried your tongue and the pigeon bones that shattered molars. Tell them about the feast that ended with herbal purging, medicinal foot baths, and spiritual apologies to St. Elmo, patron saint of gastrointestinal distress. Because kings didn't eat to live, they ate to suffer. A medieval king's bedroom should have been a sanctuary. A private chamber for rest, solitude, and perhaps the rare moment of unbothered silence. But it wasn't. Not even close. Because while kings slept in the biggest beds in the realm, they were also the least likely people to get an actual night's sleep. In truth, royal bedrooms were anything but restful. They were political stages, public hallways, birthing rooms, gossip dens, and sometimes impromptu courts. And at night they became echo chambers of rattling teeth, flickering torchlight, and scratching from within the walls. Let's begin with the bed itself. Royal beds were enormous, typically made of oak or walnut, elevated like a stage and covered with layers of linen sheets, wool blankets, furs and embroidered silks. Some were canopied, not for aesthetic reasons, but to keep rats and insects from falling onto the royal face while sleeping. The mattress, stuffed with feathers if you were lucky. More commonly it was filled with straw, hay or dried pea husks. Over time these compressed and shifted, creating mysterious lumps that could stab you mid-dream. And while feather beds were considered luxurious, they came with their own complications. Lice, mites, and a smell that lingered somewhere between barn and fireplace. Clean sheets were rare. Changing the bedding was a labour-intensive ritual, involving multiple servants and occasionally a carpenter to hoist the frame. Linens were washed infrequently, maybe once per month, more if someone important bled or vomited on them, which meant that most royal beds were seasoned. Now, about privacy. It didn't exist. A king didn't sleep alone, and not just in the romantic sense. Bedchambers often housed multiple people: servants, pages, bodyguards, personal chaplains, and sometimes favoured courtiers who refused to leave. The walls were thin, if they existed at all. In wealthier castles there might be a privy chamber or an inner room for the king alone, but more often the sleeping space was part of a suite, open, draughty, and constantly bustling. If the king stirred at midnight, someone noticed. If he murmured in his sleep, someone wrote it down. Noise was a constant. Snoring, coughing, the creak of boots on stone, muffled arguments outside, the clatter of chamber pots, dogs barking in the hall, the wind shrieking through unsealed windows, and of course, the bells. Monastic timekeeping meant that prayers happened all night long. Bells rang at midnight, at 3 a.m, at dawn. Each toll a gentle reminder that God never slept, and neither would you. Even on nights when no one died, no storm howled, and the castle didn't burn, rest remained elusive. The cold didn't help. Stone walls radiated chill, especially in winter. Fires were kept burning, but drafts slipped in through every crack. The royal bed was often piled so high with blankets that movement became impossible. One chronicler described a king who woke buried like a pastry beneath his own furs, and still his toes went numb, and then there were the bugs. No matter how fine the linens, insects thrived. Fleas in the fur, mites in the mattress, lice in the pillows. Bed bugs were especially fond of the warm, damp crevices between seams, and their bites were recorded in multiple royal diaries, often referred to as itchy visitations. One king was so tormented that he had his entire bed disassembled and burned, only to discover that the bugs had migrated into his robes. There was no escape. Even when kings managed to fall asleep, their dreams were rarely peaceful, because for a ruler, nighttime was when the real threats crept in. Assassins, poison, betrayal, a cupbearer with shaky hands, a brother-in-law with too much ambition. Many monarchs slept with weapons under their pillows. Some locked the door and kept the key on a chain around their neck. Others trusted guards, though guards had a tendency to fall asleep or take bribes. The fear was real. One royal manual advised, "Sleep not with thy face to the open hall, lest ill befall thee in thy dreams or from thy kin." Subtle. On top of everything else, the noise, the bugs, the fear, kings were expected to wake early. Dawn prayers, morning audiences, sunrise processions. A monarch's schedule began at first light, often with cold water splashed on the face and a servant pulling yesterday's hose back up over swollen feet. There was no concept of a day off, no weekends, no sleeping in. Even illness wasn't a guaranteed excuse. A sick king might be allowed to stay abed, but his chamber would be filled with doctors, bishops, advisors, and worried relatives before he could fake a second cough. So yes, the royal bed was grand. It had golden embroidery, carved posts, velvet curtains, and a view over the misty battlements. But it was also home to parasites, political anxiety, chronic insomnia, and at least one unexplained smell that lingered no matter how many lavender sachets were hung. It promised rest and delivered obligation. These were the nights that age a king. Not the battles, not the taxes, not the endless petitions, but the hours between dusk and dawn, when the castle creaked like a dying ship, and the soft padding of servant feet whispered that the world would never stop watching, not even while you slept. Especially not while you slept. For all their gold, power, and divine favour, medieval kings shared one unavoidable human truth. Eventually they had to poop. And when they did it like everyone else in the 13th century, over a cold, dark hole, in a wall, sometimes in the wind, sometimes in front of an audience. Because in the grand hierarchy of medieval misery, few experiences were as humbling, or as risky, as relieving oneself from the throne. Let's talk about the garderobe. This was the medieval royal toilet, a long, narrow shaft built into the castle wall, ending in open air with a flat wooden seat above it. If you were lucky, that seat had a hole carved into it. If you were very lucky, it had two. The name garderobe literally means to guard one's robes. That's because people hung clothing in the same room, believing the ammonia from waste would repel lice. Yes, the toilet doubled as a closet. Efficient. Terrifying. These facilities were typically built over castle moats or sheer drops, allowing waste to fall directly down the outer wall. On windy days, the experience was interactive. There was no plumbing, there was no flush. There was, in many cases, no door. Some garderobes had a curtain. Others faced open courtyards, where archers could wave good morning to a squatting monarch. And because royalty rarely did anything alone, the king might be attended even during these moments. A page might wait outside with warm water and linen. A servant might hold the royal robe out of harm's way. A scribe might even be present. not to witness the act, but to read aloud and make use of the time. You'd be amazed how many state documents were reviewed in the garderobe. Some bore the royal seal with suspicious stains. To make matters worse, the architecture was unreliable. Castle walls shifted over time, wood rotted. There are records of toilet floors collapsing beneath nobility, dropping them into pits or onto rocks below. One unfortunate royal broke his leg mid-defecation and had to be winched back up by a team of horrified guards. This became common enough that some guardrobes were reinforced with stone, not for sanitation, but structural survival. Let's not forget the cold. In winter, the royal backside met a wooden seat chilled to the temperature of regret. Drafts blew straight up the shaft, turning every visit into a test of willpower. No insulation, no heating, no privacy, just you, the wind, and the endless knowledge that anyone in the courtyard below could glance up and spot your divine majesty hovering over a hole. The term high and mighty took on entirely new meaning. Now what about toilet paper? It didn't exist. Instead, a variety of materials were used: cloth rags, if available, moss or straw, if desperate, smooth stones, if brave. One monarch reportedly used the corner of state documents, which might explain why some treaties went mysteriously unsigned. Cleansing was more spiritual than physical. Cleanliness was relative. Guardrobes weren't cleaned often. Waste piled up below, turning moats into cesspits and walls into vertical latrines. The stench wafted through the castle, especially in summer. Some castles had gong farmers, hired workers who emptied cesspits. They were paid well, lived separately, and were socially avoided for obvious reasons. But even their efforts couldn't overcome the sheer volume of royal bowel movements. There was a famous case of a king halting a feast mid-course because the smell from the garderobe had reached the Great Hall. The kitchen was blamed. Of course, all of this was still better than not having a garderobe, because in many situations, on the battlefield, at royal processions, during endless church services, the king had to improvise. Chamber pots were the next best option. These were ceramic or metal bowls tucked discreetly under thrones or carried in carriages. Servants were responsible for their disposal, which sometimes meant hurling the contents from windows, a practice banned in cities, but quietly tolerated in castles. On the road, it was worse. Royal hunting trips often ended with the king crouching behind a tree, clutching his robe and praying no one sketched the moment into a tapestry. Spoiler, someone always did. And then there were the accidents. Food poisoning was rampant. Laxatives were strong and imprecise. One medieval king reportedly soiled himself during mass and blamed the devil, sparking a week of fasting and one execution. Another fainted from dehydration after a 12-hour bout of royal diarrhea brought on by undercooked eel. This wasn't just embarrassing, it was political. A monarch's strength was judged by his digestion. If the king looked bloated, whispered rumours spread of black magic or divine punishment. If he limped after a suspicious squatting injury, courtiers speculated about internal corruption, metaphorical and literal. Despite all this, toilet habits remained deeply ceremonial. Some kings had custom-made seats, others had toilet thrones carved with their coat of arms. One monarch demanded rose petals be scattered in the garderobe before every use. Another had incense burned in the corridor to mask the royal echo. But no amount of luxury could hide the truth. Everyone in the castle knew when the king was in the garderobe, and when he wasn't, they knew how recently he'd been there. It's not the kind of royal history you see on museum plaques, but it was real, and it shaped policy, personality and palace design more than anyone would admit. Because if you ruled a kingdom from a cold wooden seat above a moat full of sewage, you didn't just hold power, you held it while clenching. If you were lucky enough to kiss the hand of a medieval king, you might have noticed something odd, something quietly disturbing behind the curtain of gold-threaded robes and polished rings. His breath. It beds smelled like cooked garlic, rotting meat, clove syrup, and something faintly resembling wet parchment. Because royal mouths in the Middle Ages, they were war zones, and no crown could protect a king's teeth from the horror happening inside his face. Let's begin with the basics. Royal diets were famously rich in meat, sugar, and wine. All delicious, all catastrophic for oral health. Vegetables were rare. Fibre was almost non-existent. Sugar, especially imported from the East, was a luxury and a curse. A single feast might include stewed plums, candied orange peels, honey-drenched pastries, and fruit preserves baked into dense tooth-packing crusts. Add in a few rounds of wine, thickened with resin or syrup, and the royal molars didn't stand a chance. There were no toothbrushes. At best, kings cleaned their teeth using linen cloths, twigs, or their own fingernails. Some dipped twigs in salt or vinegar for abrasion. Others used charcoal dust. A few had access to powdered oyster shells, essentially sandpaper for your gums. Toothpicks were carved from silver, bone, or wood, and often worn as status symbols. Some kings chewed on aromatic twigs like licorice root or cloves to freshen breath. They helped, briefly, but they couldn't stop what was coming. Decay set in early. Teeth blackened, cracked, and crumbled. Cavities bored into molars like termites through oak. Enamel wore down from acidic wines. Gums swelled, bled, and receded. Many monarchs were visibly disfigured by their dental issues. Chronic abscesses distorted the jawline. Swollen cheeks were concealed under beards or elaborate collars. One royal chronicler described his king's mouth as a grinning wound within. The pain was constant, and relief primitive. Dentistry, such as it was, belonged to the barber surgeon, a man who could trim your beard, lance your boils, and yank your molars all in the same visit. There were no anaesthetics, no antiseptics, just iron pliers, wooden mallets, and brute force. A royal extraction often involved two men, one to pull and one to hold the king down. If a tooth shattered mid-pull, which happened often, the fragments were scraped out with metal hooks or left behind to rot. Bleeding was profuse, infection was common, survival was a coin toss, and yet kings endured. Because toothache wasn't just painful, it was political. A king seen clutching his jaw, wincing through dinner, or refusing to speak risked appearing weak. Chronic dental pain could alter behaviour, warp decisions, and shorten tempers. There are historical accounts of royal treaties delayed due to swollen jaws, of declarations of war shouted through clenched teeth. One monarch had his entire lower molar row removed just to avoid suspicion that he was losing his edge. He ate only broth for 6 months and was praised for his stoic discipline. Breath was another matter. No amount of clove oil or anise chewing could fully cover the stench of decaying teeth. Court records describe a king whose breath was so foul that courtiers stood several paces behind him, even outdoors. Another was rumoured to carry perfumed cloths to hold over his mouth while speaking. But the rot could never be masked for long. To make matters worse, some kings experimented with tooth preservation. This included rinsing with urine believed to whiten teeth, applying ground herbs mixed with wine, smearing honey on gums to soothe the spirits and attract ants, packing holes with crushed clove and wool, using powdered toad bones as a dental poultice. None of it worked. Most of it made things worse, but the belief persisted that a king's breath was a reflection of his soul. A sweet scent indicated piety. A foul one suggested sin, or worse, sorcery. A few unlucky monarchs were accused of being possessed, simply for exhaling near a bishop. And then came the toothworms. Yes, really. In medieval Europe, it was widely believed that toothaches were caused by tiny worms burrowing into the enamel. Illustrations in medical texts showed little creatures gnawing at molars. Treatments included smoking the mouth with burning herbs, attempting to charm the worms out, or even chanting prayers directly into the cavity. One record notes a king receiving an exorcism for his molar. The pain went away. So did the tooth. By late adulthood, many monarchs were nearly toothless. Portraits were painted with tight-lipped smiles. Speeches were shortened. Chewing was delegated to kitchen servants, who mashed meat into pastes and pre-chewed bread into royal pulp. Spoons became more valuable than knives, and yet this was the standard. In a world without fluoride, floss, or even reliable soap, dental decay was simply another weight the crown-bearer carried. A daily torment hidden beneath gilded smiles and perfumed cloths. Behind every royal decree was a swollen gum. Behind every banquet toast, a cracked incisor held in place by willpower and prayer. Consider the reality behind the glamour. The crown may have glittered on the king's brow, but his mouth was often a crumbling cave of rot and regret, defended only by cloves, superstition, and the distant hope that someone might invent the toothbrush, preferably soon. The most powerful man in the kingdom could command armies, raise taxes, and banish nobles with a flick of his jewelled fingers. And yet, he couldn't stop scratching his butt. Because underneath the velvet, fur, and brocade, medieval kings were crawling. Not metaphorically, literally. With lice, with fleas, with itches that lingered like political rivals, persistent, invisible, and impossible to truly eliminate. Let's start with the basics. In the medieval world, hygiene was more philosophical than practical. Cleanliness was associated with the soul, not necessarily the skin. Bathing was rare, especially in winter. Water was cold, difficult to heat, and, according to physicians, dangerous when applied too often. And so, skin went unwashed, hair went uncut, clothes went unchanged for weeks, sometimes months. Fleas and lice flourished in the seams of royal garments, in the folds of collars, in the lining of furs. They nested in mattresses, travelled in wigs, and colonised the interior of ceremonial gloves. Even kings couldn't escape them. Royal garments made matters worse. Robes were heavy, layered, and impossible to clean thoroughly. A single outfit might contain a linen undershirt, a wool tunic, velvet surcoat, fur trim, brocade cloak, embroidered gloves, silk hose, leather shoes with curled toes. All of it sealed the body like a humid greenhouse, the perfect breeding ground for parasites. And when the king began to squirm, everyone noticed. There were attempts at prevention. Kings wore sachets of herbs, lavender, mint, rue, and wormwood, believed to repel insects. Some even lined their clothes with dried flowers or tucked rosemary into their collars. It smelled lovely, but it didn't work. Parasites didn't mind. In fact, they treated the royal body like a buffet. Head lice lived in hair and beards. Body lice preferred the seams of clothing. Fleas moved freely, biting ankles and hiding in woolen cuffs. Even ceremonial crowns weren't safe. The padded lining beneath the gold made an ideal nesting site. Royal physicians tried to help. They prescribed lye soap, which burned the skin but not the insects. They suggested shaving body hair, effective but politically humiliating. One king had his entire torso waxed in an attempt to discourage creatures of the fold. The results were traumatic. Others turned to folk remedies, rubbing vinegar on the scalp, dusting the body with sulphur, placing garlic in one's shoes, sleeping beside onions to draw out the worms. These made the king smell like a condemned stew. Still, the itches returned. It wasn't just a matter of comfort. The presence of parasites was seen as both a medical condition and a moral failing. Lice were believed to result from an imbalance of humours or divine punishment for pride. Fleas were linked to sinful excess. So a scratching king wasn't just uncomfortable. He was suspicious, vulnerable to gossip, a potential warning sign that the crown itself had fallen out of favour with heaven. Some monarchs went to great lengths to hide their affliction, adopting stiff postures and blank expressions during public events, even as their thighs burned with the urge to scratch. And it wasn't only lice and fleas. The royal body also hosted mange-meats which burrowed into skin folds, scabies spreading in courtly circles through shared beds and clothing, ticks brought in by hunting dogs and found days later in armpits or groin, worms contracted from undercooked food and detected only when symptoms became too disturbing to ignore. There were records of kings excusing themselves mid-ceremony due to what was politely termed torments of the flesh. One noble chronicler described his ruler's twitchy gait as the cursed dance of the netherich. Laundering was no solution. Royal laundry was done irregularly, and even then mostly for appearance. Heavy outer garments were brushed and scented but rarely scrubbed. Linens might be washed, but in cold water and without soap strong enough to kill pests. Parasites simply moved from one clean tunic to another, following the heat. And because castles were full of furs, fox, beaver, wolf, sable, the insects thrived year-round, nesting deep in the fibres and emerging only when they detected warmth and blood. The king was always a moving target. Even sleep offered no escape. Royal beds, as previously discussed, were hotbeds of infestation. Feather mattresses, fur blankets, and rarely chained sheets gave parasites a permanent foothold. Some kings ordered their beds fumigated with sulphur smoke before sleep. Others placed brass bowls of burning herbs at the foot of the bed to ward off pests. But in the end, most monarchs awoke scratching anyway. And by the time they reached the throne room, sweating beneath 6 layers of ceremony, the crawling had begun again. So the image of a medieval king, majestic and unmoved, it was a performance. Behind every regal expression was a man wondering whether he just felt something moving in his codpiece. The crown didn't grant immunity, it just added another layer under which the lice could hide. In paintings and pageants, the crown gleams like a beacon of power, golden, regal, untouchable. But place that same crown on your actual skull and you'll discover the less glamorous truth. Medieval crowns weren't just heavy with symbolism, they were heavy, period. And wearing one for more than a few minutes, it hurt, badly, because the real burden of monarchy wasn't always war or politics or treason. Sometimes it was just your head throbbing beneath 5 pounds of gemstones. Let's start with the object itself. Medieval crowns were designed to be seen from a distance. That meant big, bold, and brazen. Thick bands of hammered gold, studded with sapphires, emeralds, pearls, and enamelled figures of saints and angels. They weren't fitted, they weren't ergonomic. They were display pieces, flattened rings or towering circlets meant to announce supremacy and possibly decapitate the unsteady. The average weight of a ceremonial crown in the High Middle Ages, between 2.5 to 6 pounds. And that didn't include the underpadding, a tight-fitting coif, sometimes quilted, often soaked in sweat within minutes. Crowns weren't worn just at coronations. They were donned during feasts, masses, processions, trials, diplomacy events, and occasionally just to remind the court who was boss. Some kings even insisted on eating while wearing their crown, which made chewing awkward and digestion worse. One chronicler noted that the crown caused His Majesty's brow to weep. That's medieval, for he was sweating bullets. But discomfort wasn't limited to heat and weight. Crowns caused lasting physical damage. Prolonged use led to neck strain, vertebral compression, and tension headaches that could stretch from temple to jaw. Kings frequently developed stiff posture, not from dignity, but from guarding their spine against the crown's drag. In older monarchs, this took on grotesque proportions: tilted heads, chronic migraines, and visible hunching. Some had their chairs altered to support the back and keep the head upright during court sessions. It worked. Barely. One physician's notes from the 14th century list the following symptoms from excessive crown use: throbbing in the temples like the strike of bells, a noise in the ear as of bees in battle, a sorrow behind the eyes, a tightness in the jaw which does not abate, The weight of heaven pressing on the skull. That last one, poetic, but also accurate. There were even adjustments made to crowns for aging rulers. Some monarchs had lighter crowns commissioned for daily use. Others wore imitation versions made of gilded copper or tin during private ceremonies. One king famously switched to a circlet lined with rabbit fur to prevent divine bruising. But pride often got in the way. Wearing a lighter crown was considered a concession to weakness. And in a world where power was projected through posture, no ruler wanted to be seen slouching beneath their own authority. So they endured. And the headaches endured with them. There's also the issue of balance. Crowns, especially the ornate ones with high points and arches, had terrible centre of gravity. Lean too far, and the whole structure wobbled. Bend at the waist during mass, and it might slide off. One coronation in the 13th century was nearly halted when the crown fell forward during the anointing, striking the bishop in the face. He bled. The crowd gasped. The ceremony continued anyway because heaven forbid a king pause for first aid. And then there were the pressure points. Cushioning inside the crown was minimal. Sometimes it was just a leather band. Sometimes nothing at all. Sharp edges dug into the scalp. Heavy gems compressed blood vessels. In summer, heat collected beneath the metal, turning the whole crown into a sweaty oven that seared the forehead. Some monarchs developed bald spots where the weight pressed consistently. Others developed calluses. One royal surgeon described a sore in the shape of the crown's rim that scabbed and reopened with each use, a literal mark of sovereignty. But perhaps the worst of it came during ceremonial processions. Imagine walking through a throng of nobles and clergy, balancing 5 pounds of metal on your skull, eyes straining under candlelight, your robe trailing behind you like a muddy net, and every muscle in your neck screaming for relief. And all the while your face must remain serene. Your gait must be slow, majestic, controlled. Your bladder must remain cooperative. You're not a man, you are a symbol, and symbols don't sweat or stumble, even when the crown is sliding sideways. Some kings got creative, wearing the crown for hours. They stood completely still and shifted their weight from toe to toe in imperceptible rhythms. One even practiced breathing techniques to distract the head. Others simply rotated duties, crown on during major events, off during private councils. Still, the expectation lingered. A king looked more kingly with the crown on his head, not under his arm. The irony, all that agony for something they couldn't even see themselves. Crowns weren't made to be worn, they were made to be witnessed. So when someone romanticizes ruling with a crown upon their head, remind them, it pinched, it overheated, it weighed like regret. And sometimes it fell off mid-speech and broke a bishop's nose. When most people picture medieval war, they imagine battlefields, swords clashing, banners flying, knights charging into glory. But sometimes, war didn't begin on the field. Sometimes it began at the dinner table. Because when your political alliances were glued together with venison gravy and strong wine, one bad feast could unravel the entire kingdom. And in the case of at least one infamous royal banquet, it did. Feasting was more than indulgence in the medieval court. It was diplomacy. Every course served, every toast raised, every glance across the hall was a carefully choreographed display of dominance, wealth, and subtle threat. The royal feast was the stage on which kingdoms proved their stomachs were stronger than their enemies' swords. The table was where peace was made, and more often, unmade. Now imagine, a grand hall lit with 100 torches, walls hung with embroidered tapestries, platters groaning under the weight of roasted game birds, sugar-coated dates, eel pies, and whole pigs stuffed with chestnuts and regret. Gold cups are passed. Harps play in the gallery. The air reeks of rosemary, hot grease, and unspoken tension. A king sits at the high table, flanked by his nobles, and across from him, his allies. Allies in title, anyway. because under the perfume of hospitality lurks the real scent of fear, betrayal, and indigestion. At one such historic feast, chroniclers tell of an evening that began with music and ended in a battlefield. The occasion? A royal wedding. The guests? Rival houses, uneasy peace, and one particularly pompous duke with a grudge older than his wine cellar. As was tradition, the kitchen spared no expense. Peacock roasted and redressed in its own feathers. A stew of almond milk and porpoise meat. Yes, really. Tarts shaped like castles. Custards sculpted into likenesses of saints. And the centrepiece, a roast goose glazed with honey and spiced with long pepper. So slick it might as well have been wearing armour. This goose would be the catalyst, but we'll get to that. Feasts followed strict protocol. Guests were seated by rank. Food was served in stages, from subtle, soup, fish, white meat, to strong, game, pork, sharp cheeses. Servants moved in choreographed waves, carrying trenchers, pitchers and bowls of scented water for washing fingers between courses. But beneath this civility, tension simmered. One guest made the mistake of sitting slightly higher than his station. Another ignored the first toast. A third spoke too loudly about someone else's illegitimate cousin. And then came the wine. Medieval wine wasn't delicate. It was strong, often sweetened, and frequently spiced with cinnamon, ginger or galingale. It was stored in wood, sometimes for years, and could vary wildly in strength. A few cups in, and nobility became less noble. Tongues loosened, boasts turned to insults, jokes landed sideways, and then came the goose. The bird was wheeled in with fanfare, golden brown, skin glistening, garnished with rosemary and whole lemons. As per custom, it was to be carved ceremonially in front of the high table, its juices soaking into silver trays. But the floor had recently been scrubbed, and the servant had recently been drinking. He slipped, the platter tipped, and the goose, that cursed, treacherous, oiled-up goose, launched off the table and collided with a noble's lap. His silk tunic, imported from Venice, was soaked in fat. He rose, he swore, he demanded the servant be whipped. The king, trying to maintain dignity, refused. The noble struck the servant himself. A duke objected. A goblet was thrown. A dagger was drawn. The feast ended in blood. Swords clashed in the hall. Guests fled. Servants screamed. The minstrels kept playing, possibly assuming it was part of the entertainment. 3 men were injured before guards arrived. The wedding was cancelled. The alliance shattered, and within a week 2 kingdoms declared war. All because of a bird. This wasn't unique. Feasts were inherently risky, not just for digestion, but for diplomacy. They were tightropes of etiquette, walked while drunk, hungry, and dressed in clothing that restricted breathing. One poorly timed jest, one perceived slight, one over-served guest, and decades of treaty could go up in a roast goose smoke. Food was power. The ability to serve exotic dishes like swan, porpoise, or candied pine nuts demonstrated wealth and control of trade routes. But it also invited envy, and envy, in courtly settings, was flammable. Even the act of carving meat was a show of dominance. The royal carver was trained not just in anatomy but in choreography. Each motion was symbolic. Too forceful, and it looked vulgar. Too delicate, and it appeared weak. One monarch famously dismissed a duke for carving with his left hand. Apparently the goose wasn't the only one slippery with politics. After the banquet disaster, the hall was scrubbed, the floor salted, and the offending servant dismissed, though likely not punished, as it was quietly agreed that the goose had been doomed from the start. The king never served it again. Instead, pheasant became the new centrepiece. Lighter, less slippery, more predictable, but the damage had been done. War dragged on for 6 years. Thousands died. And every chronicler of the age recorded one quiet, absurd truth. It all started with a roast goose. A king was supposed to be invincible, untouchable, chosen by God, armoured by steel, lifted above the grubby masses by divine will and the weight of his ancestors. But medieval kings bled just like everyone else, and when they did, the bleeding didn't stop. Because battlefield wounds in the Middle Ages weren't just dangerous, they were catastrophic, and royal blood didn't make the injuries cleaner, it just made the cleanup more complicated. Let's begin at the front lines. Despite what paintings suggest, kings did not simply sit on hills and wave banners. Many led from the front, sword in hand, shouting over the clash of steel and the groan of horses. Armour helped, yes, but no plate, chainmail or padded jack could protect against everything. Blunt force crushed bones, arrowheads slipped through the gaps in mail, and the worst injuries came not from enemy blades, but from their own horses collapsing beneath them, pinning legs, smashing pelvises, or dragging royal limbs through mud, manure and trampled corpses. Infection was not a possibility, it was a guarantee. If a king survived the initial injury, if he wasn't trampled, skewered or abandoned, he faced what came next. The medieval surgeon. A man with no anaesthesia, no sterilisation, no real understanding of internal anatomy, and often no formal training. But what he did have: knives, hooks, hot irons, and a hearty appetite for improvisation. Wounds were treated with wine or vinegar if available, or stuffed with herbs like yarrow or sage, not to heal, but to stop the smell. Deep cuts were stitched with gut or silk. Though infections bloomed anyway, there were no antibiotics, there were no gloves. Surgeons operated barehanded, often in the same clothes they wore to breakfast, and when rot set in, as it always did, the only option was amputation, with a saw, while the king bit down on leather and tried not to scream too loud. But even if you kept the limb, you didn't always keep the flesh. Gangrene was common, so was necrosis, the slow death of tissue, turning skin black, bubbling with pus and attracting flies. And that's where the maggots came in. To the modern ear it sounds medieval in the worst way, but in fact maggot therapy was one of the only effective treatments of the time. Certain fly larvae would eat only the dead tissue, leaving the healthy flesh behind. They cleaned wounds better than any poultice or priest. And so, royal surgeons would deliberately introduce maggots into festering cuts, sometimes dozens at a time, and cover the area with cloth soaked in honey or oil. The patient, meanwhile, lay perfectly still, listening to the faint squirming beneath his bandages, praying the crown still fit his swollen head. This wasn't a rare occurrence. Nearly every battle-ready monarch bore scars. Some limped, some went blind in one eye. One king lost half his jaw, forcing him to drink from a silver tube embedded in his cheek. Another lived with a wooden prosthetic arm, jointed with brass and covered in velvet to look ceremonial. Each injury became part of the royal image. Each scar was a reminder. The crown is one with blood and it exacts a toll. But wounds weren't just physical. Post-battle fevers set in. Skin turned red, tight and blistered. Pus leaked from reopened stitches. Flesh buzzed with heat. Some monarchs hallucinated for days, babbling about visions of saints or the devil in their pillows. Royal physicians debated causes: bad air, divine punishment, poisoned arrows. The truth? It was sepsis, but that word didn't exist yet, so instead they applied leeches, burned incense, offered prayers, and hoped. Recovery was slow if it came at all. Healers recommended wine, roasted garlic, rest, and avoidance of bad smells. Wounds were bled to balance the humours. Bed linens were changed once a week if the king was fortunate, and if the flesh began to stink again. More maggots, more honey, more smoke. Surviving meant scars, twisted limbs, missing fingers, craters in thighs, calcified lumps in ribs. These weren't hidden, they were paraded. A scarred king was a proven king, one who had faced death and returned, stitched, limping, gritted, but still crowned. One monarch reportedly had an open sore on his leg for 20 years, weeping nightly into his linens. He ruled until his death, a kingdom managed between pained winces. But not all kings made it. Some died from small wounds, a dagger nick to the gut, an arrow to the thigh. In the absence of germ theory, a paper cut might as well have been the plague. Because no matter how ornate the throne, how gold the sceptre, or how divine the birthright, one infection could end it all. Every king had secrets. Some were political, some were personal, and some were buried, literally, behind stone walls, under loose flagstones, or tucked inside ornate wooden closets no servant dared open without knocking 3 times and saying a prayer. Because medieval royalty lived in a constant state of surveillance and suspicion, and nowhere was that more obvious than in the royal private chamber, a place that doubled as a sanctum, a strategy room, and a booby-trapped panic cave. It wasn't just about keeping others out, it was about staying alive. Let's walk through the royal quarters, not the throne room, that was for show, not the great hall, that was for spectacle, but the innermost chamber, often connected to the sleeping quarters, accessed through narrow corridors and guarded by a rotating cadre of loyal, red, terrified servants. This was the king's real heartland, and it was filled with strange things. Start with the closet. Not for clothes. In medieval times, closet referred to a small private room, used for prayer, reading, or escape. It was often windowless, stone-lined, and contained a single chair, a writing desk, and sometimes a bolt hole. These closets were fortified. Some had hollow walls to muffle conversations, others had trapdoors leading to secret passages, escape routes in case of rebellion or assassination. One monarch had an entire tunnel dug beneath his castle, leading to a decoy chamber furnished to look like his sleeping quarters, complete with a stuffed dummy in bed. And yes, people tried to stab the dummy. Why so paranoid? Because everyone was trying to kill him. Court assassinations were alarmingly common. Royal food tasters existed for a reason, and poison was a favourite tool of both enemies and trusted allies. So the king's chamber became a battleground of invisible threats. Goblets were made of silver not for style, but because it supposedly changed colour when exposed to poison. A myth, but comforting. Meals were served from double-sealed platters. Some kings demanded a different servant for each course to reduce the risk of coordinated poisoning. Even the salt was suspect. And water was terrifying, especially from wells. So kings often drank wine, ale, or spiced water, boiled and infused with herbs to disguise any potential tampering. One monarch had his chamber pot tested daily, not just for leaks, but for signs of tampering. Another required 3 servants to confirm the scent of his candle wax before lighting it, fearing poisoned fumes. Sound extreme? Several nobles died of perfumed gifts in the 14th century, wax tablets laced with toxic resins, or embroidered handkerchiefs dusted with arsenic. The royal bedchamber itself was a fortress of rituals. Beds were checked for hidden blades and loose stones each night. Tapestries were lifted, floorboards tapped, pillows were shaken. Some kings refused to sleep in the same bed 2 nights in a row. One monarch reportedly kept 4 identical bedrooms and chose randomly at bedtime to avoid a premeditated strike. And then there were the locks. Oh, the locks. Medieval royal chambers often had 5 to 7 separate locks on a single door, each operated by a different servant. The keys were kept in different parts of the castle, or rotated between stewards. In one case, the chamber door was locked from the inside with an iron bar, and then a bench was shoved under the handle, and a chest. And sometimes the king slept with a dagger under his pillow just in case. But nothing was more terrifying than mirrors, polished metal, not glass, usually bronze or silver backed. Some monarchs believed mirrors could trap souls, or worse, reflect the face of an assassin waiting behind them. So many kings covered their mirrors at night, not for modesty but for survival, and when sleep did come, it came lightly. Royal physicians recommended sleeping upright to avoid suffocation of the humours, which conveniently also made the king harder to smother. Some beds had bells attached, tiny chimes that would ring if the curtains moved. Others had false canopies concealing spikes or chains to drop on attackers. And if none of that worked, there was always the panic passage, because many castles, especially in later medieval periods, were built with secret escape routes leading to towers, gardens, or even disguised chapels. Monarchs memorized the turns like prayers. Some practiced their escape by candlelight, others crawled through them just to stay familiar with the feel, and if those routes failed, well, you hoped your food taster was still alive. All of this paints a picture not of power, but of pressure. Because the closer a man came to the crown, the more he lived in fear of his reflection, or what might be hiding behind it. So next time someone tells you they want to live like royalty, ask them, do you want a trapdoor in your closet? Do you want to sniff your candle before lighting it? Do you want to cover your mirror at night? Not out of vanity, but because you're afraid it might look back. The death of a medieval king was not quiet. It was not noble. And it was certainly not clean. Because when a monarch died in the Middle Ages, it wasn't just a man slipping away under candlelight. It was a rotting avalanche of flesh, politics, prophecy, and paranoia, all collapsing beneath the velvet sheets of a palace chamber that smelled increasingly like boiled cabbage and impending betrayal. And the worst part? Nobody cried, at least not yet, because tears came later. After the scheming, after the will reading, after the body stopped twitching. Let's begin in the chamber. The king, aged, bloated, possibly gangrenous, is lying on a bed the size of a wagon, surrounded by sweating courtiers and wide-eyed clerics who are trying very hard to pretend this is a dignified process. But it's not, because the royal body is failing, and it's failing loudly. Medieval death was slow, especially for kings, whose wealth meant they often lived long enough to suffer. There were no painkillers, no 4 drips, no quiet, sanitized fade-outs. Instead, there was the rattle of fluid in the lungs, the slurred speech of organ failure, the raw stench of infected sores, and the rising panic of a court that was already whispering about what came next. Doctors, or rather physicians trained mostly in astrology and guesswork, would be present. They'd apply herbal compresses. They'd bleed the king to balance the humours. They might even burn leeches over hot coals and waft the smoke beneath his nose to summon the spirit. None of it worked, but it looked busy. The king himself, he might be hallucinating. Fevered kings spoke in broken Latin, cried for long-dead mothers, or cursed nobles by name. Some clutched at unseen demons. Others confessed to crimes nobody dared write down. And all the while the chamber grew heavier, not just with sweat, but with expectation. You see, the king's death didn't happen in a vacuum. It happened on a battlefield of ambition. Because every noble in the room was thinking the same thing. What happens the second he stops breathing? And so, even as the royal bowels began to release, which they always did and always before death had officially been declared, a quiet race began. One servant slipped out to alert the treasury. Another headed to the armory. Someone pretended to fetch a priest but was actually notifying the heir. Someone else was already unlocking the royal closet to inventory the jewellery. And the scribe, already writing the death proclamation before the king actually stopped wheezing. But the body still lingered, swollen, sweating, barely human. Because kings didn't die easily, especially not when they were already half decayed from chronic infections, strokes, or untreated gout that had turned their legs into purple bags of fluid. One king was said to have burst 2 days after death from internal pressure. Another oozed so much that the chamber had to be scrubbed with lime and ash. Yet another was too large to fit in a coffin without strategic folding. Once the death was confirmed, usually by placing a mirror, polished bronze, under the nose and seeing if it fogged, the rituals began. First came the undressing, which wasn't gentle. Royal garments had to be removed carefully to avoid tearing, but quickly enough to prevent further liquefaction. Then the anointing. Oils, herbs, and sometimes honey were rubbed into the body, not for religious reasons, to delay the stench, because embalming as we know it didn't exist. Instead, royal embalmers used cloves, myrrh, frankincense, and salt. The body was opened, internal organs removed, sometimes stuffed into jars, sometimes burned, and the cavity filled with linen soaked in resin or wine. It was messy, it was smelly, it attracted flies. But it had to be done fast because the king's body still had a political role to play. The corpse would be dressed in full regalia and displayed for days, sometimes weeks. This period was known as the lying in state, and it was both a ritual of mourning and a grotesque form of propaganda. The body had to look kingly, not swollen and not oozing, not leaking pus through the seams of the robe, but it always did. So attendants applied makeup, yes, makeup, to darken the lips and hide blotches. Nostrils were stuffed with herbs, hands were waxed to hold the sceptre without drooping, and then came the funeral procession. The grand, slow, grim parade of symbolism and silence during which the body might tip awkwardly inside the coffin, the crown might fall off mid-bump, horses might panic from the scent, and someone, somewhere, was already crowning the next king in secret. By the time the final prayer was uttered over the stone tomb, the mourning had begun, but only for the politics. The body, it was already forgotten, its juices soaked into the velvet, its legacy traded for new alliances, its bedsheets burned, and that's why nobody cried. Because royal death wasn't about grief, it was about vacancy. A chair was now empty, a crown was now loose, and in medieval politics a crown without a head was just an invitation for chaos. You've officially survived the most revolting royal sleepover in history. Maybe you're still awake, maybe you're already drifting. Either way, if you enjoyed this grim little bedtime journey through the most glamorous misery imaginable, I'd quietly ask you to leave a like, or even subscribe, but only if you're still conscious. If not, that's fine. Medieval kings rarely listen to reason either, and if there's another part of history you want to see dragged into the torchlight, disgusting, hilarious, and honest, just whisper it into the comments. But for now, let the dust settle, let the chamber doors close, and let your thoughts drift gently and quietly into the dark silence of a world long past. Good night.